How does weed affect your memory? Which sea creature tastes better when it's stoned? These questions and more will be answered as we dive into the surprising truth about marijuana. It seems unlikely that a plant so useful to people just happened to evolve in just the way it did, containing a feel-good high and medical benefits all wrapped up in one neat little package. So how did it happen anyway? That's precisely what researchers from the University of Toronto were looking to figure out when they started digging through the ancient genome of a strain of hemp called Finola and a strain of marijuana called Purple Kush. Their findings, published in the journal Genome Research, revealed a surprising truth. Marijuana plants produce THC and CBD thanks to a random set of instructions that ended up on one single cannabis genome, and it was kickstarted by a virus that scrambled the plant's DNA and multiplied massively. Researchers added that they now think that this ancient viral infection had a side effect, which was to split the genetic instructions for making THC and CBD into two separate codes. If that's not weirdly convenient enough, it's also important in the practice of engineering plants to contain one compound without the other, or ensuring the perfect ratio of the two. Seems like viruses may not be all bad all the time. Countless people choose to light up a joint at the end of a long day because it makes them feel better, and it's the same reason many people might be tempted to grab a slice of chocolate cake. Funnily enough, the two are more similar than they might seem at first glance. Way back in 1996, research for the journal Nature revealed that the brain receptors activated by marijuana were the same receptors that were activated by chocolate, just on a milder scale. Pretty straightforward, right? Fast forward to 2019, and the cannabis market is booming. Dispensaries had to figure out exactly how to label what a customer is getting in a product, including THC levels, but chocolate edibles presented a bit of a problem. Zucker Hillside Hospital Assistant Unit Chief of Psychiatry Scott Krakauer explained to Healthline that when cannabis and chocolate are combined, something happens to THC levels, but no one knows for sure what that something might be. What we do know is that the more chocolate there is in a product, the less THC shows up. What does that mean for potency? Who knows?
All right, here's your brownie. You got about 30 minutes to get someplace safe.
Just imagine the thrill of welcoming a newborn bundle of joy into the world, and then experiencing the completely different thrill of finding out that your baby has tested positive for marijuana use. Would the authorities believe parents saying they had no idea what had happened? This dilemma got researchers in North Carolina involved in a weird series of events in 2012 when an extraordinarily high number of infants started testing positive for pot use. They suspected something else had to be going on, and there was. It turns out that a weirdly large number of baby products, particularly baby-friendly soap and shampoo from big companies like Aveeno, contain chemicals that were found to interfere with test results, particularly cheaper test results by hospitals that wanted results as soon as possible. Even the researchers who discovered the connection aren't entirely sure what's going on. They suggested to Live Science that it's possible the soaps have a chemical structure similar to the compounds in marijuana, or that a reaction between the chemicals in the soaps and the tests caused the false positives. Either way, they stepped in quickly, noting that time was of the essence to prevent unnecessary involvement of social services. In 2020, the PNAS published a paper called Cannabis Increases Susceptibility to False Memory, and it describes an odd phenomenon. Researchers recruited 64 people, gave them either cannabis or a placebo, and then tested them to see how susceptible they were to agreeing to false memories when questioned about what they saw on a virtual reality simulator. They concluded that cannabis made people more susceptible to remembering things that didn't happen than people who'd gotten the placebo. Along with that came a warning. With the legalization of marijuana both medically and recreationally in a number of states, police would have more run-ins with people who were legally partaking.
Have we forgotten that the use of marijuana is illegal?
Well, I have, glaucoma.
I get nervous in crowds.
Herpes.
When it came to questioning witnesses, for example, researchers argued that authorities needed to remember that asking leading questions to someone under the influence of THC could result in potentially devastating misinformation being given. Other researchers say that's not actually what's going on, that it's not a matter of false recall, but just a reflection of the tendency of people to get super agreeable while high. There's a limit, though. According to cannabis expert Dr. Mary Clifton, the reliability of memory and recall hits a point about a week later where people who were high remember it just as clearly as people who weren't. The question of whether or not lobsters feel pain has been debated for a long time, and therefore whether or not it's cruel to boil them alive is up for debate. They don't have a nervous system like humans do, but as Queen's University Belfast professor Dr. Robert Elwood pointed out to the CBC, species have evolved much differently underwater than above land. So what does that mean for cooking lobsters? Chef Charlotte Gill had an interesting take on making the transition from carefree crustacean to lobster roll a little less traumatic, and that was basically to get the lobsters high. In 2006, after a study confirmed that lobsters can be impacted by the same chemicals that make marijuana so pleasing to people, she decided to see if getting lobsters stoned before throwing them in the pot made a difference. As she told National Geographic, not only did it mellow out the lobsters, but putting a stoned lobster back in the tank with others helped everyone chill out. There was another bonus, too, as Gill described, the lobster meat actually tasted sweeter, it tasted better and lighter and was actually more tender. The experiment was short-lived thanks to the state's health department, but Gill continued doing the same thing with a different food-safe additive. Is she onto something? Formal research in 2021 suggested that she is. Professor Sean Lockery of the Institute of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon may call it hedonic feeding, but the rest of the world knows it for what it really is, the munchies. Science has known for a while exactly what it is that gives people the munchies when they smoke pot, and it's pretty complicated. In a nutshell, THC acts on the brain in a few ways that all come together to make us crave Cheetos and pizza. In addition to releasing the hunger hormone known as ghrelin, it also heightens our sense of smell and taste, lowers inhibitions, and overrides a part of the brain that signals when we are full. In other words, it's a perfect storm for destroying the snack cabinet. It seems like that might be a pretty human-specific thing, but in 2023, Lockery published research that found that nematodes, worms so small that they're best viewed under a microscope, also got the munchies when exposed to cannabinoids. The tiny worms were put in an area with sections containing different foods, as if they were humans let loose in a cafeteria with a burger stand and a salad bar. Researchers knew the nematodes were impacted by the cannabinoids when they gorged themselves on their favorite bacteria, and just kept right on going.
Hungry. 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 Still hungry.
Is there a point to this? Surprisingly, yes. Lockery claimed that a genetic connection between the worms and cannabis may lead to additional discoveries about metabolic disorders. In 2016, media outlets like the Washington Post reported on a story that put a particular sort of person in a tizzy. It started in Hugo, Colorado, when officials warned residents not to drink the local water because tests had come back positive for THC. It was a false alarm, and those in the know weren't surprised. Why? THC isn't exactly water-soluble. Air, on the other hand, is another matter. And that brings us to Italy circa 2012. That was when the Institute of Atmospheric Pollution Research wrapped up a year-long study that looked at the psychotropic content of the air over Italy's major cities, and they discovered that a few are basically the equivalent of a college dorm on a Friday night. It's no surprise that college towns like Bologna and Florence ended up having the highest concentration of free-floating marijuana particles in the air. It's not like going to spend a weekend in either one of those cities is going to have anyone coming down with a 48-hour high. The concentration is way too low for that. However, it has been suggested that monitoring air quality for concentrations of various illicit substances could be a useful way of making connections between factors such as drug use and crime statistics, health data, or other social markers. The 2020 movie The Marijuana Conspiracy has a title that makes it seem like a fear-mongering propaganda piece along the lines of reefer madness, but it's not exactly trying to push an agenda. Instead, it's a story of 5 women who bond during a weird government experiment that was put together to determine what happens to the body when someone smokes pot every day. It's based on a true story, and it had some weird consequences. Back in 1972, the Canadian government put millions into research ahead of a proposed plan to legalize marijuana. As part of that research, 20 women were recruited and divided into 2 groups, one of which was given increasingly potent doses of pot every day for 98 days to see what would happen. One of those women was 21-year-old Doreen Brown, who told the Toronto Star that she was having a good time, until she wasn't. She elaborated, "We were asking them to take it away. They knew we wanted it taken away, there was no doubt. I felt comatose. I couldn't do anything. It became torture." Participants described terrifying side effects like hallucinations, breathing difficulties, and feelings of loneliness made worse by their physical isolation in a Toronto hospital. Getting out wasn't the relief they thought it would be either, as many ended up in therapy to deal with their lasting feelings, mostly of fear and paranoia. The official results of the study have never been released, not even to the participants. Marijuana might have the reputation of being the substance to partake in on a lazy afternoon after a long and stressful day at work, or when it's time to kick back and relax with some old friends. In other words, when it's chill-out time.
Hungry.
But weirdly, researchers found that what's actually going on in a person's brain while they toke up is the opposite of that. In 2015, researchers from the Yale School of Medicine published a study in the journal Biological Psychiatry, saying they discovered that THC increased a specific kind of brain activity called neural noise. Neurons in the brain fire with electrical activity as they transmit information, but sometimes they fire without carrying any messages. That's neural noise, and it's like a human version of television static. The researchers found that the higher the dose, the more disruption there was. Researchers from the University of Texas at Dallas confirmed those findings in 2018, and interestingly, they stress that the increased neural noise is there even when the person in question isn't doing much of anything. Dr. Shika Prasad explained that there could be a few strange consequences, including interference with brain activity, a disruption in processes, and an increased need for concentration.